17. Both Takuda and Vost were wrong in their estimations of the time needed for their respective tasks. The Section Contact Patrol, headed by Gunso Arsenault, was back in 6 days rather than the 7 that had been allotted. That event had opposite effects on Takuda and Vost. One was happy, the other decidedly was not. Vost's unhappy reaction had more to do with the difficulties in breaking out the other mechs from the dropship than the desk patrol returning too soon, however. When they'd pried the lamb out, it had been with the single thought of freeing it from the strained hull of the dropship. They'd paid little heed to the relative position of the rest of the mechs in relation to the breach. Most of the cutting of the hull had been at the top along the main dorsal spar. The dross produced by the cutting and the subsequent wrenching of the hull had made an opening for the lamb, but it had pinned the other mechs behind the slag. In the excitement of the original extraction, no one had thought to plan for the future. The second problem had to do with the lamb's actual exit. Because they hadn't been able to cut an opening big enough for the lamb, which had been transported in the air configuration to walk out of the dropship, Seagroves had been forced to take it out as an air vehicle. The exhaust gases from the Allied AVR-Tech 125 jet propulsion system had vented straight into the hull of the dropship, where they had played havoc with the interior. It would have been better if they had cut gas escape ports into the opposite side of the hull, but there had been no time for that. The other mech pilots had managed, in varying degrees, to protect their machines from the gases, but other equipment had suffered considerable damage. The blast of the exhaust had been deflected downward onto the cargo deck by the opposite side of the hull, the force and heat annihilating the portside cargo access doors. They wouldn't be doing any cutting on that side of the dropship. The blast had continued into the base of the cargo bay, warping and melting part of the decking. Some of the gases had escaped into the lower holding compartments. The rest had penetrated into the open space of the main bay. The velocity and force of the jet propulsion exhaust had scattered anything not secured, as well as some things that were, against the starboard skin and braces. Thus, it was not a matter of simply freeing up the mechs and letting them climb out the opening cut for the lamb. Before they could release the mechs, the work parties had to repair the damage done by the blast and cut free the refuse that was stuck to various portions of the interior. Vost's Panther was the mech most buried. It had suffered some damage from the fiery exhaust, and all the systems would have to be checked and repaired before it could be activated. Vost insisted, however, that his mech receive first priority for extraction. For 3 days, Vost spent all his time in the Panther's command seat. The hot gases had scoured the cockpit glass, and Michel Guardin had spent the whole time spread-eagled across the bubble, using a grinding wheel to smooth the crazing and polish the surface. The ogive of the glass was made of high-low surface tension material that was both extremely tough and extremely fragile. The high surface tension of the wind screen made it virtually impervious to all but a direct hit, while the low surface tension of the interior of the glass would act as a shock absorber. The brittle outer surface would break up the incoming round, but the softer inside would flex ever so slightly to distribute the force of the hit over the entire surface. If the outer skin, a mere 2 millimeters thick, were scratched, the inner surface would lose its structural integrity and collapse. Guardin had to be very careful to use only the finest grit to polish away the marks on the outside. The work of clearing would have gone faster except that the other mech pilots spent the time on their vehicles. In a mercenary unit like Vost's, each warrior was the actual owner of the mech he piloted, even though the group was under the nominal military command of the leader. It was very difficult, except in a tactical situation, for Vost to get all his people to work toward a common goal. He tried to persuade, and then order, the other pilots and their techs to help out with the Panther, but his efforts came to naught. Holly Goodall was the first to tell him where to get off. and the other pilots quickly followed suit. Only Pesht, the javelin pilot, was willing to help, and even that was done more with an eye to getting his javelin free. By the 6th day, the Panther was almost out, and Vost estimated that it would only be a few more hours more before the Javelin was also up and operational. As the work neared completion, a plan began to solidify in his mind. Until now, he'd been unable to do anything about getting rid of the Dest team because his mechs had been inaccessible. Now his first move was to mention to Seagroves that one blast from the Lamb's heavy lasers could blow the Dest command bunker, by now a significant structure, into oblivion. Seagroves had demurred on the grounds that attacking the headquarters would not do any good. The heavy weapons section, commanded by Aryake Sane, would react and dismember his mech with a few well-aimed shots. Vost had nodded and smiled. Things would be different, he said, when all the mechs were out. The conversation rested there, but the seed had been planted. Late on the afternoon of the 6th day, Arsenault and his section patrol returned to camp, their appearance a surprise to all but Takuda, who had maintained contact with them through the secure voice communicator in his headset. Before the patrol had set out, he and Arsenault had coordinated on time and frequency for transmissions. Most were carried out by laser line-of-sight light wave carrier. Radio, an archaic system, was only used as backup. Takuda and Arsenault had decided on the older system because the mercenary unit's comlinks were laser primary. They would probably never think to use the radio backup, and even if they did, the possibility of them finding the correct frequency was slight. In addition, all voice transmissions were scrambled so that even if someone located the transmission, he or she would have no idea what was being said. The line had remained secure. Arsenault went immediately to report to Takuda, but he'd barely begun before members of the mercenary unit began to filter into the headquarters bunker. Takuda could have stopped the ingress, but decided against it. He knew that the information would get out soon enough, and he wanted to maintain an open relationship with the mercenaries. He let them in as Arsenault continued to talk. The first part of Arsenault's report consisted of an overview of the patrol, the routes taken, and the terrain traversed. All of this was interesting to Takuda, who would have to plan any movement to the west, but it was deadly dull to the mercenaries. All they would need do was hop into their mechs and travel like the wind. The mercenary technicians, on the other hand, took some interest because they would have to walk out. Then came the part that Vost especially wanted to hear, the report on the enclaves and the possibility of making a deal with one of them. The report was short, sweet, and to the point. Arsenault said he'd obtained the information by observation from a distance and via limited contact with humans who had ventured away from the immediate vicinity of the walled towns. Arsenault had done most of the talking, acquiring some, but not very detailed information. There were 3 enclaves, he said. The one to the north was called Osio, and seemed to be under complete centralized control of a dictator. This was much like the old von Rohr's dynasty taken to the extreme. They were a recognizable group, but they had all of the human attitudes of that long-dead dynasty. They hadn't had the experience, or did not assimilate the experience, of the McAllister years. They hadn't learned anything. The second was Amatukaze, a religious enclave that had fallen back on the pure Shinto Buddhist philosophy. They were fundamentalists who regarded the other enclaves as heretical in the extreme. Where Osio wanted to dominate, the Amatukaze would like to exterminate. This was religion taken to the extreme. The third was Usugumo, an enclave controlled by a merchant oligarchy that had subverted everything to the god of profit. They had the most money, but were dominated by a group of families who exploited everything they touched. Arsenault's visitors listened listeners received the information with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Vost was ecstatic. Takuda was depressed. Vost now had a base from which to deal. The militarists of Osio would be more than willing to buy a weapon system that would make their dictatorship supreme. The fact that they were the Von Rohrs personified made little difference to him. The only fly in that ointment might be their possible desire to swallow up the mercenaries into their rigid hierarchy. Definitely not an appealing prospect. The Amadukaze's hatred of the other two enclaves would make them more than willing to see the others crushed, and they would probably pay well to see it done. But Vost had dealt with religious fanatics before, and knew that once the mission was accomplished, they would expect him to continue to embrace their cause. That was fine with Vost, as long as the cause aligned with his interests, which, in this case, did not sound very likely. The Usagumo group was a real possibility. They sounded amoral, willing to pay in cash for what they wanted, and Vost could use offers from the others as a baseline for his dealings with them. The negotiations would be sweet. He rubbed his hands with prospective delight. Takuda did not see it that way. He'd been thinking about the matter ever since hearing about the other humans from Dakota. Here had been the perfect opportunity for a group of warriors to build the perfect Bushido-based society far from the hurly-burly of the inner sphere. They could have established the traditional samurai society of warriors and workers, taking all the traditions to their natural conclusion. But that was not what they had done. No, they had fractured their small society into hostile groups. He and the others would have to act as spiritual guides for the original humans, showing them back to the true way, the path of harmony. He looked up at the circle of faces that surrounded him in the headquarters bunker. "We must move slowly," he said. "There is much that we can do here, but we must lead these people away from their hostility to the true path of harmony. We must become the moral exemplars they seem to have lacked, but we must go slowly. We must build a society that the Draconis Combine, should they ever find us, would be proud to call its own." His statement was greeted by stunned silence. "Like hell we will," said Vost, who promptly turned on his heel and stomped out of the bunker.